What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and I am back from Warhammer Retreat, streaming all weekend, 5 games of 40k, and we had some barn burners, so please go check out the VODs if you are interested in some late-stage 9th edition 40k games. But it was also Warhammer Fest weekend, and we've got so much Warhammer Fest stuff to talk about. Was released the content of the new Leviathan boxed set, the new starter set for 10th edition Warhammer 40k, and some insane new models both for Adeptus Astartes and for Tyranids that are being released in that. And I just want to talk about them today. We're going to do a little bit of an impromptu video this time. I don't have anything prepared, but what I do want to do is go through these new miniatures, new sculpts, talk about what I think about them and what we may see them do on the table. So let's dive right in. So here we are on Warhammer Community with the contents of the Leviathan boxed set. It's looking like it's going to be somewhere around the line of $250 US. I'm in the US, so that's the one that's most relevant for me. But it is a very hefty box when it comes right down to it. So all told, we have a unit of Sternguard veterans for Space Marines, a Infernus Squad that we talked about the datasheet for yesterday, alongside a unit of what looks like 5 Space Marine Terminators, alongside all the characters. 4 characters for Space Marines, the Apothecary Biologist, the new Gravis Armored Apothecary for Space Marines, the new Phobos Lieutenant, the new Terminator Captain, who is actually, I think, one of my favorite Space Marine characters. I didn't really look at this model too much when I first looked at the contents of the set, but the more I see him, the more he's kind of growing on me. Plus, the Terminator Librarian has been previewed previously. It's a little goofy in my opinion. All the runes and stuff and the armor is a little over the top, but he just kind of looked like a Chaos model, but it is what it is. He's pretty all right. Alongside the Ballis Dreadnought, the new Redemptor ranged fire support chassis. Over on the Tyranid side, we're getting a big brick of Termagants alongside a Ripper Swarm. Now, we don't know if the Ripper Swarms are going to activate independently or work alongside the Termagants, and here's the Ripper Swarm right here. Alongside 3 Von Ryan's Leapers. These were previewed ages ago. I haven't really talked too much about them, but they are sort of small Lictor assault troops, effectively. A brick of 5 Barbguns. Let's talk about these guys a little bit later. These are range fire support Termagant adjacent units, I guess. 10 Neurogance. These are a new variety of Termagant style unit, which I guess is a Synapse repeater, which is kind of cool with their special unit champion guy. The Screamer Killer Carnifex, a winged Tyrion Warrior, Tyrion Prime, I should say. The Nero Tyrant, the new Zoanthrope offshoot, might replace the Neurothrope, but Neurothropes maybe go in the way of the Dodo in 10th edition. I wouldn't be shocked to see a lot of those unit upgrade characters be gone and instead be replaced by these bespoke kits. Alongside the Psychophage, who is totally new. They were shown off in the trailer, but it didn't really look like they were the scale that they are in real life. But one of the wildest models that we've seen in a while. So let's jump into the close-ups for each of these models. Now here's the Space Marine Captain I talked about earlier. I think it's just a really solid sculpt, to be honest. A little generic, but that's okay for the Space Marines. And I think that's kind of the theme of all the Space Marines in this release, is that they are kind of painfully generic. But obviously that is intentional because this is intended as an onboarding product. It's for new players, so you want your Space Marines to not have too much detail, too much stuff that locks them into a chapter or is too difficult to assemble or paint, because new players are going to get turned off by that. They're going to open up this kit with 1,000 million parts, and they're going to see that you have to fiddle with every single little purity seal on your Space Marine Captain and get disheartened. We should be expecting to see these models be pretty straightforward and easy to assemble. But I think this is a good implementation of a tactical rock in his base, because it looks like you can assemble him without the rock. Overall, just kind of impressed by him. The front forward picture doesn't look like it does as much justice to the model as the angle from the side. He looks a lot more dynamic here. He's got a lot of motion, where he's definitely charging. He's trailing a sword behind, and then you can see like sort of the motion on the purity seals and his cape. You can't see that from the front, really. Pretty impressed. Wish there was, or at least hope there is, a helmeted version. I do like all my characters to be helmeted personally, but I'm probably not playing Space Marines, to be fair, so I'm a Tyranid person at heart, so I don't think that's a huge deal for me. The Librarian and Terminator armor, We've seen this one previewed already. Again, a little goofy, a lot going on. He looks like a bit of a Chaos Sorcerer vibe, so I'm not going to dive too far into this dude because I have already talked about his sculpt previously on the channel. But moving forward, we do have the new character, the Apothecary Biologist. Apothecary stat lines are really interesting because it is always an open question of whether or not you want to push them to be as difficult to kill as possible as like a frontline combatant, or make them as cheap as possible. Toss up, at least in 9th edition, whether or not you play a Primaris Apothecary, a Ravenwing Apothecary, or a Standard Apothecary. Ravenwing Apothecaries, I think, have all told just ended up being the best, and part of that is because the way that Ravenwing interact with characters has been very beneficial, especially if you give that guy Rites of War over Selfless Healer. Then he's going to be able to move really quickly and play for objectives really well. Now, whether this guy beats out classic apothecaries, the Firstborn Foot Apothecaries, is going to be interesting to see. I mean, he's got a lot going on, right? He has basically almost a servo harness full of surgical tools. Plus, he has whatever this big gene seed container is. And I don't know if that is going to have some sort of mechanical representation on the table. But if it is, it may be that this guy has a lot more going on than a regular apothecary. He's also Gravis armored, so most likely other apothecaries won't be able to join Gravis troops, and he will. And that will differentiate him slightly from the other apothecary styles. So, really interested to see what this guy does. And I mean, to be fair, what apothecaries do in general. I imagine that they're mostly going to be a survivability bot. They're going to make the unit they attach to much more difficult to kill. And having a Gravis armored unit with that sort of effect, you know, maybe a Mark of Tzeentch style effect where your first failed saving throws disappears, he maybe gives the unit feel no pain. He can maybe revive models of the unit. All of those on an aggressor squad sounds pretty brutal, and I think that would be a combination that we see pretty often. Basically taking him instead of the more offensive-oriented characters like captains or lieutenants to push their survivability rather than their damage output. We also have the Lieutenant in Phobos armor. We've seen this guy before. He feels like a little bit of an RPG character that like somebody who really likes to min-max makes, where, well, he's good at fighting. He's got the best knives. He's got the best gun too. He's like a fighter, 2-weapon fighter, dual classed into ranger. You know, real min maxed to get his combat stacks. He's got like dexterity 22, upgrade a magic item. He's a reaver, so you know he's got a skull helmet in there too. He is an angsty boy, and the PC playing him is actually really terrible at role playing. So we all know that guy every time we play D&D, and that feels like the guy who made this character. He's just the do everything guy. He's got 3 knives. He's made out of half Tyranid. He's a veteran of 1,000 wars and doesn't speak much anymore, and also gets a combi weapon on top. Moving on to the Sternguard Veteran Squad. Now, this really, I think, showcases a big paradigm shift in Games Workshop's release of new Primaris units, because this is basically just a Firstborn Sternguard Veteran Squad, but they've been turned into intercessors. I think that what we are seeing, and I think that this is the general consensus as well, I don't think I'm really breaking new ground saying this, but I think that what we're seeing is an amalgamation of the Primaris Space Marine and Firstborn Space Marine lines, where no longer are we going to see Sternguard veterans and Primaris veterans broken into 2 separate datasheets. We're going to see a single datasheet for both of them. They're going to have unified keywords, and you're going to be able to use Firstborn Marines both as your existing Sternguard veterans or within the unit of a Sternguard veteran squad using these models. So these will most likely mesh with the existing metal or finecast Sternguard veterans without a problem. Now, again, this is another unit that falls into that kind of painfully generic category. They're just an intercessor squad, but they have tabards on. And, I mean, they look fine, I guess. The Sternguard veterans were always very, like, tactical, and all of the different bolt weapons. This looks totally impractical. Like, this guy has sights, but then also a magazine on top of them. And as silly as that is, it's kind of a totally over the top. It does look kind of cool. I appreciate that box mag is super funny. But we see like the scoped bolt rifles, the Stalker bolt rifles. We see the classic auto bolt rifle. They've got all, you know, their Picatinny rails and stuff on there, which looks great. And then we also see an inclusion of a lot of combi weapons. So the weapon selections of this unit are going to be really interesting. Maybe that they have their own special issue bolters still, and then they can replace those for combi weapons if they want the anti-infantry role. We'll just have to wait and see. Really looking forward to what these guys do. I'd like to see Sternguard veterans do a little bit more than they have in the past. I don't like the use case of having just a Marine unit that has expanded weapon options over, you know, just a regular tactical Marine. I would love to see them have some unique special abilities. And in 8th edition, they had a stratagem that gave them +1 to wound with their range attacks, which actually made them super sweet and super unique. And that got removed in 9th edition, but it was, I feel like, a real drawback to the Stern Guard Veteran Squad. If they had a similar, you know, sort of ability to pump their damage output, I think these guys would be awesome. Still looking pretty good. I mean, Classic Space Marines kind of get me going a little bit. The Terminator Squad, I think I am going to skip because they've been out for so long. We've seen them ages and ages ago, and I've done tons of videos about Terminators. New Terminators look good. It's cool that they're Primera scale, and yeah, I don't have much else to say about them. And then the Infernus Squad. We talked about these, the datasheet for these, yesterday in the video, but unfortunately the models, not that exciting. It is an interesting thing, and I've seen some people rail against the ubiquity of Marine squads, at least Primera squads, that bring a single weapon type to the table. So we see this obviously with Hellblasters, with Intercessors, with Desolator squads. All of these different units are a single, like, Intercessor profile, and they all have one type of weapon together. Whereas you look at an old school tactical squad, and you have a special weapon guy, a heavy weapon guy, and a bunch of bolter guys, and a sergeant who has, you know, a thunderhammer or whatever. It's actually okay, and here's the reason why. Special weapon squads that are being introduced in the Primaris Marine line are a concession to the mechanics of 40k. It's certainly a mechanical and a rules design consideration more than it is a lore or modeling consideration. 40k being a full, you know, a unit game where your game entities are represented by multiple models, ability to include heavy weapons and have those heavy weapons operate in a way that's interesting and fun is very restricted. So if the only way you get access to heavy weapons is within small infantry squads, you basically just start artificially increasing the size of your game. So you start forcing people to buy more dumb bolter infantry to take their heavy weapons. And with the game at the scale that it is, where a bolt gun is never going to be particularly lethal because you have to have the game be able to be scaled up to, you know, a huge horde of enemies or a Titan, the bolt gun is going to get outclassed immediately, basically, regardless of how you do it. So the game becomes infinitely more complex and more difficult to play and more tedious to play the more that you have combined squads that have a variable weapon loadout. So the way that they've sort of resolved this is by making the squad one weapon type at a time. And while it kind of sucks, it's not particularly realistic or interesting, and it looks a little silly, I do appreciate how it plays. Now, each of your squads has a specific role and a reason that you can include them in your army. They can design abilities for them around fulfilling that role. I'm not going to say it's great, and I'm not really going to assign a value judgment one way or another. It is a decision that has been made, and I think the decision overall is going to make 40k easier to play, but at the expense of a little bit of realism and a little bit of interesting creativity. It would have had to have been a design decision made, you know, 30 years ago, I think, to make every single army in the game have the same kind of distribution of special weapons. Obviously, they just made models and they just did whatever it is, and the designers currently are working with what they have, and the most effective way to deliver special weapons to the battlefield are in special weapon teams like Infernus Squads. That's just what they're making, and I think that is that's totally fine. There's also like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory that, you know, you want to sell people 5 Marines instead of 1 Marine with a cool flamethrower, so you make a full squad of them, and that may also be a consideration. That is the effect it's going to have on the mechanics of 40k anyway. The Ballis Dreadnought is next. Now, we talked about this guy and his datasheet yesterday as well, and I actually really like the evolution of the old ranged Dreadnought to the Redemptor chassis. I think the Las Cannon plus Missile Dreadnought works on the longer legs pretty well. It almost gives you more of a reason to be mounted on a Walker chassis, because it gives you this like sort of vantage over the battlefield, whereas a tank would be squatter and have a lower center of gravity, which is, to be fair, mostly beneficial. The Ballis Dreadnought can actually arc its weapons or stand upright in order to fire its weapons over intervening obstacles a little bit more easily. And I think the Ballis Dreadnought looks like that's what it's trying to do, and I think that's pretty cool. Obviously, walkers are tough to try to justify in any setting because they don't really make sense. But in the situation where you want your unit, your artillery unit, to be able to fire from a high position, the Ballis Dreadnought is a pretty good example of that. And the mechanics are pretty good as well. It being able to get rerolls against units that are full strength is pretty good because then it delivers alpha strikes very well, and because it will probably likely be maneuverable compared to tanks, at least I would hope so, it's able to deliver those alpha strikes effectively. So I hope I hope it works well. Interesting that it doesn't have a top gun. There's no turret gun on the top, whereas the Ballis Dreadnought has a heavy stubber system up here. The Ballis Dreadnought does not. The Ballis Dreadnought is actually sort of woefully underarmed compared to the Ballis Dreadnought, which has weapon systems in its hands and on its chassis hardpoints and on a top hull hardpoint. But I guess the las cannon maybe draws too much from the power plant or something. But this would be the unit that you would want to have anti-air capabilities, so it's kind of weird it doesn't have an Icarus. And that moves us onto the Tyranids. So excited about these guys. The Winged Tyrion Prime is the first one. This is an interesting preview because the Winged Tyrion Prime is not a unit that I was expecting to see or kind of even hoping to see in Tyranids. There have been a lot of rumors about Winged Warriors, Tyranid Shrikes coming back, and some people have taken the Winged Tyranid Prime as being an example of that. I'm not sure, and I guess what's interesting about this, and that this may be the case for the other characters in the Space Marine lot as well, if we assume that these characters are meant to attach into units, I don't know if there are any units that I would be interested in attaching a winged unit to. Maybe Von Ryan's Leapers if it can go in there, because a move 12 base character probably wants to be in a unit that moves at least 10 inches. And none of these units most likely will do that. So I kind of hazard to guess that it's going to operate alone. And we even saw it in the trailer, fighting Terminators all by itself. It wasn't with anyone. It didn't charge with a unit. But the other options for it could be units like Gargoyles or even Hormagaunts, or even units like Raveners that are ground units but are very fast. Those don't traditionally have not gotten good character support because the Tyranid ground characters are very slow comparatively. So we might be getting a fast ground character in order to synergize with units like that. And if the Tyranid Prime does that, I'm going to be psyched about it. Tyranid Primes have always been kind of a miss, to be honest, in every edition that they've been available in. While they did their best in 9th edition, I don't know if they have ever really been that great. They're fine. They give rerolls. They give it a decent imperative if you have a gun line, and they have a solid gun. But they've always been terrible at fighting, which is unfortunate for them. So you compare them to any of the other Tyranid HQs, and they're just awful in the comparison. So maybe now that there are no force organization slots, so you're not fighting over HQ slots, there's going to be more space for mid-rate characters in Tyranids where you're not just between a support caster versus a Hive Tyrant, but we'll have to see. Those medium characters tend to be where things fall down in miniature games across the board, and that's certainly been the case in Tyranids. The Nero Tyrant, super excited about this guy. Seems like he might just be a unit by himself because he brings friends with him. I wonder what they do. Preview previously was that they could be removed to reroll psychic abilities, but psychic abilities don't require rolls anymore, so it might be that they're just like Meniers for him, where they take hits or they buff his psychic powers, and that would be pretty sweet. That would allow him to be a lonesome character. Maybe he has a strong invulnerable save on the little helpers, and he himself is kind of weaker, so they're just supposed to take all the damage for him. That'd be kind of cool. Or he can sack them to do cool stuff. Either way, maybe he ranges psychic powers from them so they can kind of chain out. Whatever they do, I'm psyched for this guy. I think he's sweet. He's really grown on me, especially because they think he's not too big. If he was really big, he would look too static, but because he's basically the size of like a Parasite of Mortrex. If we see there's literally a guardsman or a Space Marine on his base, you can compare him directly to a Space Marine, and he's on what looks like a 50mm base, so he's not that big. I will say, though, that his little tail here is a little suggestive. He's just really excited to see you. And then we have the Screamer Killer, that I need to see a 360-degree spin of this model, because looking at it from the front, I think you get caught up in the big dumb head. And I think that this head is really stupid looking. It's based on the 2nd edition Carnifex head. I can see the evolution to where it got from where it was, but I think does this design, this like elongated, I mean, it's just an alien from Aliens. This elongated, like brainy design with the distended mouth it just doesn't look good. It's not cool, it's not interesting, and it brings in this new chitinous plating on the side, which looks like a predator. If this was attached and he had a big frill, if this was just a big armored head, I think I'd like it a lot better, but because it separates to expose his brain, it kind of looks weird. And I think there's supposed to be kind of directing channels for the bioplasma shot, but I don't know if it gets the idea across in execution. Now, that said, I think that because they had such a focal point, it draws your eye a little bit too much. If we look at the model from the side, as we can see in the preview here, it actually looks otherwise almost identical to a regular Carnifex, which is a body plan that I love. I think the regular Carnifex is cool. They were a little bit too front heavy in the original sculpt back from 2005 or whenever the plastic sculpt came out, and that created some problems. They basically were meant to like charge forward, but if they ever stopped moving, I think they would just fall over, which is a little silly. The Screamer Killer looks a lot more balanced, and its legs are much longer and more muscular, and I think that looks great. I just think that the head like pulls your eye a little bit too much. So what's likely to happen, I think, is that I bet you will be able to replace the head on this guy, and I bet if you just put a regular Carnifex head in here, he's gonna look fucking awesome. And that's what I'm gonna do to mine, and I think it's gonna be great. Now, one thing I will note is that kind of exemplifies this new aesthetic of having these really knobbly, almost tumorous interstitial flesh between the chitin plating, and that feels a little bit busy to me. I never really liked that. The Von Ryan Leapers have it really badly as well. I think that somebody just said like, oh, you need to up detail these interstitial parts, but without telling people what to put in there. So they just put kind of sacks of weirdness, and they don't look very good. They look kind of random and asymmetrical, and that doesn't look great on the Tyranid aesthetic, which is otherwise like very deliberate and very organic, and just having these kind of meaty sacks here. They look kind of like diseased, I guess, and I don't think that looks great. I'd love to see those be leaner and more heavily armored, maybe. Speaking of the Von Ryan Leapers, they also have that same thing. So you look at the feet here. The feet have like these really meaty distensions through the chitin, and that kind of ruined them for me, to be honest. The first time I looked at it, I saw those, and I was like, oh, what's going on? These models have a little bit too much going on to the point that it kind of detracts from them. But the more I've looked at them, the more they've grown on me, and I actually think these guys are sweet. A real nice evolution of the Lictor. I hope that they're good. I hope that they are absolutely lethal in melee. Having like a really fast little unit that can trade up, like a little trading unit, would be amazing. Interested in these base pieces. It looks like they have plastic pieces on their base as well that don't, to me, look to be attached to the model. So we may be getting some like base accoutrements for these models too, which would be cool to use both on them and elsewhere in your army. Now, the Termagants we've seen before, the Ripper Swarms are in here. Well, it does look like you get 2 Ripper Swarms. I wonder how the Ripper Swarms are going to interact with the Termagants themselves. It was mentioned that for the demos at Warhammer Fest, the version of the Termagant data sheet that had the Ripper Swarm in it, which we saw previewed, was the one being used. But whether or not that is meant for combat patrol and isn't used in the regular game, or it is actually the more advanced version, and the one that we saw on Warhammer Community previously, where they got to move after enemies moved up to them, is actually the incorrect one. That's either, it is pretty weird that that's the one that they're using, but it does mean that Ripper Swarms go from being an independent unit to being kind of a unit attachment. Who knows? These new Ripper Swarms look great, and now looking at them closely, they do look just like a little bit of an up-detailed version of the old Ripper Swarms. The poses are very similar. But it's always been tough to do justice to these little tiny swarm models because of the restrictions of the plastic injection molding medium. You have to make them one part, and that means you can't have too many bits on them. And I think that's fine. They look fine for what they are. Ripper Swarms are never really the center point of your army, so it doesn't really matter so much. We do have the Neurogance, though. A little bit of a confused design, to be honest. Tyranids are always, in my opinion, they're one of my favorite armies aesthetically, because they are so well differentiated between the types of material that they're composed of. They've always had like sort of the flexible skin bits, the slightly harder normal like carapace pieces, and then the heavy carapace pieces. And one of the reasons the Tyranids look so nice on the table in almost any color scheme is because you can pick 3 colors and you can differentiate those 3 colors and then paint all those body parts those 3 different colors, and your army is going to look pretty consistent and cohesive regardless. These Neurogons kind of buck that trend. They have a kind of light armor, heavy armor, and their regular skin, but their armor plates are almost like fused together. Like they don't have joints between them. They don't look quite right compared to other Tyranids, if that makes sense. I guess because we don't know what they do, their design is very confusing. Whatever this thing on their back is that representing a piece of war gear or something? Like, what does that do? Obviously, they have the big brain guy that they talked about in the article, piggybacking the synapse web, so they can sort of they become a synapse creature is what it sounds like. And then they can also sacrifice themselves to keep synapse creatures alive, so they're a little bit like an old school bodyguard effect for synapse creatures. But I don't know if I entirely love these guys. I actually do like their unit champion guy. I think he looks great. The rest of the unit looks a little bit, I don't know, sort of undercooked, I guess. These designs that are moving farther away from the classic Tyranid designs are always a little bit, that's one of the reasons I don't love the Screamer Killer face, and I don't really love these ones, is that Tyranids do have that really cohesive aesthetic, and these models are bucking that. And I think there's a real danger that they don't look correct in alongside an existing Tyranid army. And if you want to talk about not looking correct, the Barbguns, terrible name, by the way. Just awful. It's hard to say. Call them Barbguns. Plus, you get to make jokes about them if you do that. These look awful. These are just terrible. They're a termagant, but they've been mutated with this extra thing on the back. They have like this weird, I guess it's a spike gun. I guess it's a spike on the end, and it ejects it out. It's taking 2 of their arms, but that means the 3rd arm becomes a big tripod that's like really heavily developed, so they're going to be ungainly and kind of move weird. And the fact that the gun is on the side is just bizarre. Like, why aren't they on all 4 legs, and the gun is attached to the brain here, so they're just exocrines, right? Like, the exocrine body plan works fine. I don't know why we've redesigned it for this infantry unit, and maybe part of it is the color scheme. Painting the gun a different color really draws attention to it and how weird it looks. Overall, I really don't like this guy. I also don't like that the gun the controlling organism for the gun is so big and so obviously attached to the termagant. Like, it's clearly a termagant that has had something else grafted to it. Speaks to less of an evolutionary process to create these. Like, rather than growing them in a sack with a gun on them, they've been spliced on after birth, and it's just like feels like it's an extra step. Just make the organism with the gun in it. Why are we building a gun separately and then giving it to them to hold? That is how Tyranids work, but they've done more to hide it on other models, and in this one it really calls attention to it, and I don't think it looks very good, honestly. These these models are very bad. And speaking of bad models, the last one is the Psychophage, which I don't think honestly is bad from a technical standpoint. It looks great, but it's just a spider. As we're on the subject of Tyranids that buck the classic Tyranid body plan, spider is a pretty good example of one. Tyranids have always had kind of a dinosaurian body plan that has had the additional 6 legs on them and then a carapace on top. And this is just a spider. It's got a big abdomen. It's even got a thorax in a head. It's like literally just has all of the pieces of a regular insect. You can kind of clearly see that it's been injection molded. It has this distension around the jaws here where you can see the molds sort of fit together, and that's fine, honestly. Sometimes you have to concede to the medium that you're creating your model in, but it does sort of distract, especially because it's on such a high visibility point. Just what it's doing is always weird. These, in my opinion, particle effects in miniatures don't work too well, and this one looks okay. I like that it's sort of calling attention to the smoke chimneys that all of the Tyranids have, the spore chimneys where they're supposed to be creating spores constantly. And this one does it with like weird psychic ash, I guess, but the idea is the same. How it's going to work is beyond me. I hope that it doesn't need to eat things to then generate effects. It talks about metabolizing psychic life forms into psycho-corrosive ash. If it has a mechanic where like it gets bonuses when it kills enemy psychers, I think this thing's going to be unplayable garbage. I would hope that it's kind of a venom thrope or a toxicrin, but for offensive effects instead of defensive effects. So instead of providing -1 to hit and fight lasts and things like that, it's doing mortal wound auras. It's giving enemies offensive buffs. Maybe even reducing their defense, like eroding armor saves and stuff like that. That kind of stuff would be really interesting and cool. And I hope that that's what the Psychovore does. If it is just a thing that interacts with the psychic mechanic, I can't imagine that it's very playable. This does not look like the addition for Psychers, but we'll have to see what Psychers do. But even then, most of the armies in the game don't take Psychers, and I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. If they weren't already in 9th edition, it would shock me if they were in great numbers in 10th. So Big miss here, in my opinion, for the Psychophage. You know, technically it does look pretty cool. If this was in a Forest Goblin release for Age of Sigmar, I actually think the Psychophage would smash it out of the park. But because it's in Tyranids, this faction that doesn't look anything like this, it's a little funky looking. I'm a good 50-50 on the Tyranid releases. The Space Marine ones look fine. They are Space Marines, and Space Marines are Space Marines, and they are a good evolution of the existing Space Marine sculpts, and the characters look great. I think the Infernus Squad is a little bit unfortunate, and the Sternguard veterans are a little bit maybe too generic, but otherwise they're fine. For the Tyranid stuff, I think the Psychophage is kind of silly. All the infantry looks fine. The Barbguns are a little bit of a miss, and the Neurogance are kind of whatever, as well as the Psychophage. The Screamer Killer, I just don't like the head. I think the rest of it looks fine. But otherwise, pretty happy with it overall. So anyway, that's all I have to say about the new starter set for 40k. Really looking forward to get some mechanical information on these guys. I will try to, if I have time this week, talk about the mechanics that were previewed at Warhammer Fest, and we'll give my thoughts about what we can look forward to in 10th edition. But otherwise, let me know down in the comment section what you think about all these models. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers as well. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.